Ever since the UK summer riots in 2024, I've been worried about what we can actually say online. Not knowing the truth left me feeling angry. I felt like I couldn't say anything. So I wanted to look at what the law actually says. Before I get into this, I'm just going to clarify I'm not a lawyer, and nothing here should be taken as legal advice. And one last thing before I start, this is just going to be about what we can say online. It's nothing about the actual rioting offences. Part 1. My claim. If the police or government want to prosecute you, they probably can. And if they don't want to prosecute you, they probably won't. Their motivation is inconsistent and often political. I'm going to try and back this up by going through what the law says. We'll do a bit of analysis, go through some examples, and you can decide for yourself whether you agree. Part 2. The law. I found this quite confusing as there's a lot of different offences out there. I'm going to summarise 2 bits of legislation that I think are most relevant. I'm going to try and read through them, so apologies if I get tangled up on the wording, because they are quite specific wording. So the first one is the Public Order Act 1986. 4A, intentional harassment, alarm or distress. So, Section 1, a person is guilty of an offence if, with intent to cause a person harassment, alarm or distress, he A. uses threatening, abusive, insulting words or behaviour, disorderly behaviour, or B. displays any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, thereby causing that or another person harassment, alarm, or distress. So the defences are either the person is inside a private house and had no reason to believe anything would be seen or heard outside that private house, or the conduct is reasonable, balanced against the right to freedom of expression. I also want to highlight the mental element of this. So under Section 3 it says, a person is guilty of an offence under Section 4 only if he intends his words or behaviour, or the writing, sign, or other visible representation to be threatening, abusive, or insulting, or is aware that it may be threatening, abusive, or insulting. So he intends it, or he is aware that it may be. Okay, moving on, stirring up racial hatred. So racial hatred means hatred against a group of persons defined by reference to colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, or ethnic or national origins. The offence is acts intended or likely to stir up racial hatred. So this is under use of words or behaviour or display of written material. Section 1. A person who uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or displays any written material which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, is guilty of an offence if A. he intends thereby to stir up racial hatred, or B. having regard to all the circumstances, racial hatred is likely to be stirred up thereby. There are 2 defences to this one. The first one is, again, the person is inside a private house and had no reason to believe anything would be seen or heard outside that private house. And the second one is the person did not intend his words or behaviour or the written material to be threatening, abusive, or insulting, and was not aware that it might be threatening, abusive, or insulting. Okay, the next one is the Communications Act 2003, Section 127, improper use of public electronic communications network. This is quite an infamous one. It gets memed on a lot. So let's look at what it specifically says. So Section 1, a person is guilty of an offence if he, A. sends by means of a public electronic communications network a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character, or B. causes a message or matter to be sent. And Section B, a person is guilty of an offence if, for the purpose of causing annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety to another, he A. sends by means of a public electronic communications network a message that he knows to be false, B. causes such a message to be sent, or C. persistently makes use of a public electronic communications network. There's no defence written in this part of the Act for this. just to quickly touch on hate crimes, my understanding is there's no specific hate crime. Hate crime is when the victim or witness perceives such hostility towards the victim regarding the offence with the motivation of a protected characteristic. So these are things like race, disability, religion, or sexual orientation. For example, intentional harassment, alarm, or distress when the motivation is because someone is transgender. I think it's worth also just mentioning the practical limitations of all this, because I imagine this is what will be used as the rationale why these offences exist. So everything has to be proven to the same criminal standards, so beyond reasonable doubt, and that's quite a high burden of proof. So they'll have to take all the circumstances into account. So this is things like what was done, what was said, when it happened, why it happened, where it happened, and what can actually be proven. The standard defense to all this stuff will be that the conduct was reasonable in the circumstances. Part 3. Analysis of the law. So let's look at each of these in turn. I'm mainly going to highlight the bizarre elements of these, or how they could be potentially misused. So starting with intentional harassment, alarm, or distress. It depends on the circumstances, but this essentially means you can be guilty of an offence for insulting someone online. Here's an extreme example. Let's say I've got a neighbour called John Smith, and I see him letting his dog take a dump on my front lawn. I then write him a message on Facebook calling him an absolute C-word. I'm intending to cause alarm or distress, and I'm using abusive and insulting words. Theoretically, I could go to prison for 6 months. Could I rely on my conduct being reasonable or freedom of expression? Probably not. Here's a more down-to-earth example. Let's say a celebrity is accused of human trafficking. Accused. I go on Twitter or X and I put out a tweet calling him an evil scumbag. Once again, I'm intending to cause this person distress using abusive and insulting words. What would stop the police from prosecuting me? My conduct could easily be seen as unreasonable, as this celebrity has not been convicted and is only accused. Do you see what I mean? It's not clear what the rules are. In all likelihood, neither of these scenarios would result in a conviction, but theoretically, it could if the government really didn't like me. Next, let's look at stirring up racial hatred. So just to clarify, this definition is wide enough to mean I can have racial hatred of someone because they come from Denmark, because that's their nationality. Also, who decides if the material is threatening, abusive, or insulting? And how insulting does it need to be, exactly? Section 1A seems reasonable to me. If you can show someone intended to stir up racial hatred, fair enough. But in Section 1B, who decides if something's likely to stir up racial hatred, given the very wide definition of racial hatred above? The best example is a real-life case I'll cover later, but a hypothetical example could be I create a YouTube video highlighting how crime figures are disproportionately high for people who come from a specific nation, and we should tighten immigration requirements for them. Such a video could easily be interpreted as abusive or insulting, and certain people could interpret this as stirring up racial hatred. I could attempt the defense of saying that wasn't my intention, but would it actually be believed? Okay, on to Communications Act 2003, Section 127. This is probably the strangest one. Starting with Section 1, messages that are grossly offensive to who, exactly? Indecent, obscene, or menacing character to who? My understanding is there's no legal definition of these terms, and they'll go with what a reasonable person would think. But standards are wildly different depending on the person. So people with dark humor who are perpetually online may have a different understanding of what grossly offensive means, or people who work in the sex industry may have a different understanding of what indecent or obscene means. Section 2 is the infamous one, where you can be guilty of an offence for causing annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety. Firstly, how do you prove the person knew the message was false? And what does persistently mean exactly here? Does it mean 3 messages? 30? 3,000? Causing annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety is so subjective and flimsy to me. How can this be enforced consistently? Let's do a needless anxiety example. A local councillor in my town has been found guilty of corruption, accepting bribes, and has been sacked. I make several YouTube videos, Facebook posts, and tweets highlighting this, calling the person an awful human being and that he should never be hired again. This would cause them annoyance, anxiety, and inconvenience, and is a persistent use of public electronic communications networks. There's no need for me to do this, as the person has already been sacked. Theoretically, I could go to prison for 6 months. Could I rely on reasonable conduct and freedom of speech? How much would it depend on the political party I appear to support? Let's round off the analysis with hate crimes. The key factor here is there must be a perceived hate from the witness and/or the victim. Who defines hate? The Google definition is feel intense dislike for. So if I really dislike someone for being Danish, I could get in a lot of trouble. I'll use 2 examples here to be as balanced as possible. So I'll use an anti-Semitic example and an Islamophobic example. So first example, I write a post on Facebook about a famous Jewish musician saying he should disappear for publicly supporting Israel for the war in Gaza. A claim is then made that I'm being anti-Semitic with the comparison of disappear with ethnic cleansing. Looking at 4A of the Public Order Act, I'm causing alarm or distress using abusive and insulting words. It could be perceived as targeting him based on religion. Who decides whether that's a hate crime? Second example, I write a tweet saying radical Islam is an ever-increasing threat to UK national security, and say we should invest heavily in policing this in the future, or terrorism will skyrocket. Communications Act 2003, Section 127. This could be seen as grossly offensive by some, and again it's based on religion. Who would decide if this is a hate crime? Part 4, the inconsistencies. I think the law is generally consistent otherwise, but with online offences it does seem odd. Here's a few examples of cases. Lee Joseph Dunn shared 3 offensive Facebook posts which depicted people of an ethnic minority, some brandishing knives. He was convicted under Section 127 of the Communications Act by sending a message that was grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. He was given an 8-week prison sentence. He pleaded guilty, by the way. Then you got Tyler K., who wrote on X, Twitter, calling for hotels, housing, asylum seekers to be set on fire. He also responded to comments saying this is 100% the plan. He was given 38 months in prison. He was convicted under Section 19 of the Public Order Act, publishing material intended to stir up racial hatred. I agree with the sentence on this one, because that could have led to deaths. Jamie Michael, next example, was charged with stirring up racial hatred on Facebook. He posted a 12-minute video where prosecutors claimed Michael's tone was unrelentingly negative towards migrants. He didn't plead guilty. It took a jury 17 minutes to unanimously acquit him. The scary part of this is he was pressured by police to plead guilty, and if he had, he would have almost certainly been given a lengthy prison sentence. Meanwhile, Hugh Edwards, who was convicted of being a paedophile, was given a 6-month prison sentence, which was suspended for 2 years. He lives freely in his home now, so let that sink in. You've got sharing offensive Facebook posts, clicking a few buttons, and being an actual paedophile. Part 5, Conclusion. Here's a reminder of my initial claim. If the police or government want to prosecute you, they probably can, and if they don't want to, they won't. It's worth noting that this legislation is not new, with the Public Order Act being 1986 and the Communications Act being 2003. It's only been enforced so strictly in recent years. I think that the speech that gets prosecuted will largely depend on the political party that's in power. An example of this is Ricky Jones, a Labour councillor. Ricky Jones said in front of a mob of people that they should slit the throats of far-right activists. His hearing has been delayed until August 2025, where I bet they're hoping the political pressure has died down and they can just give him a slap on the wrist. Of course, none of this would be a problem if we lived in a utopia, where everyone behaved properly. However, unfortunately we live in a world filled with corruption, and we will always need to be able to speak out against this. People are afraid to express their opinions. They're not sure what's legal anymore. It appears to me that the legislation is blurry and inconsistent. The fact that you can be prosecuted for causing insult, annoyance, or anxiety seems wrong, as this can be interpreted very differently depending on the individual. Personally, I think this legislation needs a change. It makes sense to me that things like harassment, abuse, threats, racism, and inciting violence are offences. However, I don't think words like alarm, insulting, distress, grossly offensive, indecent, obscene, annoyance, anxiety, or inconvenience should be in legislation, and if they are, they should have legal definitions with little left to interpretation. Also, can we make racial hatred about race again? Mixing nationality and citizenship just seems wrong. I hoped by looking at the law I'd feel more confident about what I can say, but to be honest I feel the opposite. It feels like the government pick and choose when to apply it depending on whether it's convenient for them. What do you think? Should the law change? It seems to me at the moment freedom of speech is extremely limited in the UK.